This program is being presented in two parts. In tonight's session, Erasing the Red Line, Opening Opportunities, we will be talking about the lasting legacy of redlining, urban renewal and highways, exclusionary zoning, meaning 1 acre single-family lots, for instance, and other public policies and programs that have shaped our communities here in Northeast Ohio. We will also hear about some of the many ways our local governments and nonprofits are working to open up opportunities, and more importantly, choices for those who have few, if any, housing choices because of their race, gender, source of income, or other factors. I will be your moderator for the evening. I'm Rick Jackson, host of The Sound of Ideas from Ideastream Public Media. To begin, we need to thank Real Talk's incredible community partners and contributors who help bring this and other important issues into sharp focus. Real Talk is a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that addresses inequities and disparities in education, criminal justice, public health, and democracy. Real Talk is hosted by 4 leagues of women voters in Northeast Ohio: Akron, Hudson, Greater Cleveland, and Kent, in strong partnership with WKSU, Ideastream Public Media, the Akron NAACP, and the Freedom Bloc. Tonight, we especially want to thank COHIO, that's the Coalition for Housing and Homelessness in Ohio, and our presenters from the Fair Housing Center, the City of Akron, Cuyahoga County, and CHN Housing Partners. So let's take a look at tonight's discussion. We will open with a look at redlining and the history of discrimination that restricted the places where Black people could live and how it limited Black people's housing choices to neighborhoods with limited resources or amenities. Then we'll talk about discriminatory housing practices that persist today, more than 5 decades after passage of the Fair Housing Act, which was back in 1968. We'll look at how the City of Akron and Cuyahoga County, 2 local government agencies, are intentionally reinvesting in areas that have experienced racism and discrimination over decades. Then we will hear from a regional nonprofit that's working on multiple fronts to provide affordable housing and a broad support system that not only enhances neighborhoods, but ensures that families have housing stability and homeownership opportunities. Following our presenters, we'll have a discussion and we'll take your questions. Finally, we'll offer concrete ways that you can take action on both a state and local level. Our opening speaker this evening is Carrie Pleasance, who will offer a quick redlining 101, and we'll talk about the state of fair housing in Northeast Ohio today. Carrie Pleasance is Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research, a Cleveland-based nonprofit fair housing organization with a mission to protect and expand fair housing rights, eliminate housing discrimination, and promote integrated communities. An Akronite by birth, Carrie moved to Cleveland in 2000 and joined the Fair Housing Center and was Director of Research and Investigations and the Associate Director before being selected as Executive Director in 2016. Carrie received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Geography and her Master of Arts in Geography with a specialization in Urban Geography from Kent State University. Please welcome Carrie Pleasance.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me tonight to participate in this conversation. And this evening, I'm going to speak briefly about the history of some of the federal policies, including redlining, that were used to segregate people, by race, by ethnicity, by religion, and how these policies have kind of changed and evolved over the last century, and really created the communities that we live in today. So as Rick mentioned, the Fair Housing Center, we're a small nonprofit fair housing agency that serves Greater Cleveland. Our mission is to protect and expand fair housing rights, eliminate housing discrimination, and promote integrated communities. And we do this through a variety of different programming. And the next slide, please. When we think kind of like about our hierarchy of needs in the community and why fair housing is so important, shelter, food, and clothing. Shelter is just one of the most critical needs in our community. It impacts almost every aspect of our lives. Housing impacts quality schools, access to healthy foods, to green spaces. It impacts access to jobs, access to transportation, access to healthcare. Where you live impacts your life outcomes, how much your earning potential is, your upward mobility, your exposure to environmental health hazards, and it really is the most basic of human rights. So the United States has really a long history of governmental policies that were used to segregate people of color from white residents in our communities. And one of these first policies we saw was in 1910, and that was racial zoning. So the earliest racial zoning ordinance was in Baltimore, and it specifically stated that Blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce incidents of civil disturbance and prevent the spread of communicable disease into nearby white neighborhoods and protect property values among the white majority. So from 1910 on through the decades and through the century since then, there have been government policies and programs that have, on the state and federal level, that have just perpetuated segregation. In the South, those laws would have been Jim Crow laws that would have been separate but equal accommodations. But in the North, in places like Ohio, in communities like Cleveland and Akron, there would have been other types of segregation policies. A couple of those, like sundown towns, which is exactly what it sounds like. So these were towns where people of color could have been during the day, maybe to work, but once the sun went down, were not allowed in the communities after the sun went down. Restrictive covenants. So these were deeds to homes. Right in the deeds, it was written who that home could be sold to in the future. So it was restricted who would have been allowed to buy that home. So this home could not be sold in the future to someone of color, to someone of Jewish descent, or other ethnic minorities. And then, of course, we had redlining. So redlining is a practice of denying borrowers access to credit based on the location of properties in minority or economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. So shortly after the foreclosure, or shortly after the stock market crash of 1929, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation as a way to spur economic growth after the stock market crash. And so this the Homeowners Loan Corporation created new loan terms. They had agents that would work very closely with potential borrowers to help them qualify for loans. And this is really what spurred the rapid growth in the suburbs. So this was single family lending. This was outside of the central city. And this was lending that was done to almost strictly to white borrowers. Only about 1% of those loans were made to Black borrowers, and none of those loans were made in communities that were where Black residents made up the majority of the neighborhood. So these products were really made to spur the growth of the suburbs, and really made just for white borrowers. So around the same time as that was happening, there was an economist in Chicago named Homer Hoyt, who was hired as a consultant by the Federal Housing Administration. He had just produced a report called 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago, where he had ranked ranked neighborhoods based on race and nationality and land values, determining which group of people would have the most favorable and most detrimental effect on land values. So he was hired by the Federal Housing Administration, and together the Homeowners Loan Corporation used their data and combined it with Homer Hoyt's data and created what we now call the redlining maps, which let's go to the next slide. We'll see. So these are the homeowners loan corporation redlining map. So this is basically Cuyahoga County. So in the 30s, homeowners loan corporation created this, was called a residential security map at the time, so of all major cities in the country. They sent out examiners across the country to classify neighborhoods based on their perceived value. So perceived level of risk. So they talked to people like appraisers, real estate professionals, loan officers about the perceived risk, and they combined that data from their examiners with this data from Homer Hoyt based on the race and ethnicity of the neighborhoods. And they color coded the maps where green would have been the best, blue was still desirable, yellow was definitely declining, and red was hazardous. And then these maps were used by loan officers and appraisers, other real estate professionals to evaluate mortgage lending risk. Neighborhoods that were considered high risk were often redlined, which is where the term comes from, by lending institution, and their credit was either very expensive or it was either really expensive or completely unavailable in those neighborhoods. And you could see in that previous map where the red and the yellow was, that was from like the 30s and 40s. That's really setting up the demographic patterns that we still see today. That is where minorities, where Black residents are really segregated. And then this is 2020 census data. So the patterns almost a century later are still the same. So you can go to the next slide. So in 1968, a week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Fair Housing Act was passed. And the Fair Housing Act really had two specific goals. And that first one was to eliminate housing discrimination. And then the second goal was the lesser known goal, but was to promote residential integration and undo the effects of these prior discriminatory policies and practices. So the passage of the Fair Housing Act made practices like redlining illegal, but there have been other intentional and unintentional policies and practices that have continued to perpetuate segregation and strip out the wealth of communities of color. And although redlining happened, decades ago, these policies have really set up a system of inequality that remain today. Get to the next slide, please. The same communities that were redlined are the same communities that were redlined in the past are the ones that were really targeted by subprime and predatory lenders, which we call reverse redlining. These are the communities that were hit hardest by foreclosure crisis, that recovered, are still recovering from the 2008 housing crisis. And so these are really where there's so much disinvestment in the community, these same neighborhoods that were redlined. Opposite side of the coin, people of color, low-income residents are also being systematically excluded from the suburbs through and other areas of opportunity through policies like exclusionary zoning, other types of discrimination, source of income discrimination, and other types of discrimination. So as a fair housing agency, the Housing Center is sometimes involved in litigation. And one case that we were recently involved in, recently settled, was an investigation of Fannie Mae owned foreclosed properties. We were involved with 20 other fair housing groups across the country. And we compared how properties in predominantly Black and Latino communities were maintained versus properties in white communities. So this goes back to disinvestment again in communities of color. And the housing center and other plaintiffs allege that Fannie Mae maintained and marketed the foreclosed homes in predominantly white neighborhoods while allowing those similar homes in predominantly um, uh, Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods to fall into disrepair. If you go to the next slide, I have a couple pictures of these are actual properties that we investigated in the Cleveland region. So we're looking at curb appeal, structure, signage, looking at overgrown shrubs and things like that. We're looking at paint, siding, gutters, water damage, and utilities. So what's one of the really important things about this case is it was the first time that a federal court had confirmed that the nation's fair housing laws covered maintenance and marketing of real estate owned properties. So we're still working with our attorneys and the other plaintiffs to come up with ways that we can get settlement funds back into the communities that were harmed the most by Fannie Mae's practices from that case. But again, thinking about the policies from decades ago and how they impact communities today, you know, the homeownership gap between white and Black Americans is larger today than it was over 50 years ago. Generational wealth was not passed down from parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, because of policies like redlining. Go to the next slide. Because of policies like redlining that kept groups of people from home ownership and really contributed to this huge gap in generational wealth between white families and Black and Latino families. And I just want to leave or end with this, what I think is a great quote. When we think about the relationship between all these decades of formal and informal public and private sector policies, this quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates from the Case for Reparations, you know, these policies that have been devised to segregate people of color, you know, making discrimination illegal is just really the first step in addressing these disparities that were created by these policies. And it's not enough to just make these policies illegal, but we need to address all these disparities that they've created. So, thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. To learn more about redlining, there are some good resources available on our website. Thanks to whomever popped in the Ideastream program, Divided by Design, from some years back. It is important to understand this history. That's a good reminder, too, if you don't have your chat on, there is other information rolling on the chat during these presentations. Now we'll hear from Jason Segedy about how highways and urban renewal have changed Akron and what that city is doing to reinvest in the affected areas. Jason is the Director of Planning and Urban Development for the city of Akron and a lifelong resident. He has a BA in Geography from the University of Akron, an MA in Geography and Urban Planning from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He's also been working in the field the past 27 years and is an avid writer on urban planning and development issues. Jason, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rick, and good to be talking to all of you tonight. Carrie did a great job of talking about the Homeowners Loan Corporation map, so I won't belabor it. But I did want to start there because I think it's very relevant to the construction of the Akron Innerbelt. So I'm going to talk a bit about the past, present, and future of the Akron Innerbelt Freeway. This is the Homeowners Loan Corporation map for Akron and its suburbs. As Carrie mentioned, you know, neighborhoods were categorized into 4 categories, kind of in the Homeowner Loan Corporation's opinion of better to worse. In the order of the colors was green, blue, yellow, and red. And as she said, hence the term redlining. It's a little hard to see the letters and numbers on this map, but the area D4, which is kind of at the 8 o'clock position on the map near downtown Akron, as well as C12, were the areas where the Akron Innerbelt was constructed. And when I first became acquainted with these maps, it was, I always, you know, knew of them from pretty early in my education. But when I first became acquainted with the ones for Akron, I actually read the descriptions for every single one of these areas. And it was interesting because I think that, there were many things that the descriptions of the neighborhoods, the things that were discussed were things that you or I would have felt were important if we were buying a home. There are discussions about nearby retail or the quality of the construction, things that are very legit when you're looking to buy real estate. But there were definitely a lot of things that we wouldn't, I think, see as legitimate today. Most notably the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhood. And what struck home to me, my family is Hungarian on my dad's side and Sicilian on my mother's side. And I realized if I had been born 50 years earlier, there were a lot of discussions in those Akron neighborhoods about the presence of Italians and Hungarians and, language that was kind of intimating that that wasn't such a great area to live in. But absolutely, beyond comparison, these maps targeted Black Americans, the African American community, and that's, I think, really for sure who bore the brunt of the maps, and governed everything, as Carrie said, from mortgage loans to just if realtors were showing these maps, this put notions in the buyer's head about the desirability of these neighborhoods. So I wanted to start with this map because as the freeways in Akron were built, and this was very common in many American cities, this map had a role. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the freeway plan for Greater Akron. So it might be a little bit hard to see this one, but this is from 1963. This is the freeway plan for Greater Akron. My previous role before becoming the city's planning director was the director of the Akron Metropolitan Area Transportation Study, which is our metropolitan planning organization that deals with transportation. And this map is always interesting to me. This is the vision for freeways. Like I said, in 1963, there are some familiar freeways on this map. Portions of I-76 and 77 and parts of State Route 8 were already constructed. But if you're familiar with the freeways in Akron, you will see there are a lot of freeways, some thankfully that were never built, but there are one in particular that was partially built, which is the Akron Interbelt. And just to give you a sense of the time, in 1963, the rubber industry, although it was starting to falter, was still pretty much in high gear. Akron was building a lot of tires and rubber products, and there were projections for Summit County's growth to go as high as 1 million residents. I was born shortly after 1970. In 1970, Summit County had 552,000 people. Today, it's got 540,000 people. So we did not get to the million mark. And unfortunately, the freeway that was constructed based on this very optimistic scenario for continued growth was the Interbelt. And originally, the Interbelt was part of a larger freeway that was going to span all the way from Barberton to Kent. And as time went by, the scope of the project got smaller and smaller. And if we could go to the next slide, the portion of the Interbelt that was actually constructed was what you see on this slide. So kind of on the left side, running from the southwest to the northeast is the Interbelt Freeway. You can see how it abruptly ends, just north of downtown Akron. I think this project was probably the biggest urban development mistake in Akron's history, most certainly for the effect that it had on people and neighborhoods, but also just for the way that it divided the city. And worst of all, it was never completed. So because of those overly optimistic growth projections, quickly it became apparent this road was going to cost a lot more money than was originally envisioned. And so it was never even extended to State Route 8, which is the north-south freeway you see on the right. And so we kind of had the worst of both worlds. We had a freeway that displaced around 2,000 people, uprooted a lot of households and businesses, and didn't even connect the two freeways. In fact, like one of my earliest memories is the bicentennial celebration in 1976. I was 4 years old, and the fireworks were lit off on the first phase of the Akron Interbelt, which really ran for less than a mile. And the freeway, as you see it on this slide, wasn't even completed until 1987. And so I think very soon after its completion, such as it was, the city of Akron started, it was a different time in the late 60s. There was this idea that freeways would somehow revitalize downtown. That absolutely did not happen. And Mayor Plisquelic at the time started thinking about decommissioning part of the freeway. So if we could go to the next slide. Thanks. So this is the northern fourth or third, depending on how you measure it, of the Akron Interbelt Freeway. In 2016, the city of Akron finally got the funding and completed a project to decommission about 3/4 of a mile of the northern part of the freeway. And that's the area shown in blue on this slide. I think in a perfect world, we would have been able to undo the entire roadway. But for those of you who are familiar with how highway funding works and just infrastructure in general, it's difficult. You need to cobble together a lot of funding sources, but I'm very happy we were able to at least start here. The yellow is the infrastructure that still remains. And then some of those darker yellow colors are parcels that are near and adjacent to the roadway. But Mayor Horrigan's vision for the site, we hired Liz Ogbu, who is an urban designer and a spatial justice advocate from Oakland, California. She's going to start a community engagement process this year and engage the community, and most particularly the descendants or the actual people who were displaced by the freeway, to talk about the future of this site. If those of you who are familiar with Akron, this is not an easy site to redevelop. There's a lot of topographical change. There's about a 40-foot drop to the bottom of where the freeway was for a pretty large stretch of this area that you're looking at. And so we want to be very intentional about how this is redeveloped, what it's redeveloped as. Like it could be a linear park. Perhaps there could be some sort of brick and mortar development, although in my professional opinion, I think that's pretty difficult. But with enough funding, anything's possible. But I think that we really want to think about, we were able to take a very small bite of the apple and undo part of this terrible urban planning mistake. And we do want to engage the community around what this space could be. I think our first rule of thumb is to do no harm. Whatever happens here, we want it to try to make our city a better place and a fairer and more just place. And so I would encourage all of you, if you're interested, as I said, the engagement process will start late spring and this summer. I would say that, this is going to take a long time. You won't see change or development here in the next year. This is a long-term initiative, and it's possible, eventually perhaps we could even vacate more of the freeway, but we wanted to start here. And I thank you all for your time. There might be questions later. I'll be happy to answer those, and I'll turn it back over to Rick.
Thank you, Jason. Akron is setting a great example other cities can follow. We'll now hear from Lenora Lockett, Director, Department of Equity and Inclusion for Cuyahoga County. The county has recently adopted equity zones and policies in an effort to reinvest in areas that have been the most impacted by redlining and other discriminatory practices. We can again think back to the maps that Carrie showed us a little bit earlier. Lenora was born and raised in Cuyahoga County. She's a graduate of Shaw High School in East Cleveland, attended Vanderbilt University School of Engineering, that's in Nashville, graduated magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Civil Engineering. She earned a Master of Business Administration degree from CSU, is a licensed professional engineer, active and proud member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. She volunteers as a commissioner on the Bond Accountability Commission overseeing renovation of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. She's worked both private and public, mostly public, including for the former Cuyahoga County Engineer's Office. Also served as Director of the Office of Procurement and Diversity for the county and is now Director of the newly established Department of Equity and Inclusion. And she also wanted me to tell you she's blessed to be the proud mother of a son, Aaron. So Lenora, congratulations on that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the county's new equity zone policy. As similar to the city of Akron, this is an intentional effort to address areas of historic displacement, historic disinvestment. On July 26th, 2021, County Executive Armin Budish issued an executive order declaring the establishment of equity zones and the development of policies and programs to give additional consideration to areas of historic disinvestment. Part of that, there were two key steps that needed to be comply with that executive order. First, we had to propose and get acceptance of a county map identifying those equity zones. Then as part, also, we needed to develop policies and programs where we would use those equity zones to give additional consideration, which could be either additional points so that they could have any selection process, and or if it was for a development project, for those projects that are impacting equity zones to receive more favorable lending terms. There was an internal project team that consisted of several departments, some which included the Department of Equity and Inclusion, of which I'm the director. There's the Cuyahoga County Planning Commission, the Clerk of Courts, the Department of Development, the Department of Public Works, the Office of Innovation and Performance, just to name a few. After much discussion and investigation, we settled on the 6 criteria listed before you. First, there was the criteria of below poverty. Any census block group that had a score of factor of 20% of the population being below poverty, that census block group would be automatically qualified as an equity zone. Then other areas that did not qualify automatically based on the percentage of their population below poverty, there was a combination of the other factors. If you had an aggregate score of predominant of 3 for your census block group, that census block group would be determined to be an equity zone. Those factors included, as was previously discussed by the 2 previous presenters, was 2 points was going to be allocated for the homeowners loan corporations, any block group, census block group that had a predominant grading category of C or D, which equates to the category of declining and hazardous, will receive 2 points. The next category would be median life expectancy. Any census block group that has a median life expectancy that is less than the county's median life expectancy will receive 1 point for that category. Similarly, 1 point will be awarded to any census block group that had a single family home median value that was less than the single family home median value for Cuyahoga County. Finally, any census block group that had the designation in their area of slum or blighted for the CDBG improvement target area would receive 1 point. So once each census block group was evaluated for those scores, and if they had a total score of 3, then they would also be included as an equity zone. Once that was the settled criteria, the resulting equity zones accounted for approximately 26.3% of the county's square miles. And if our estimate of the populations impacted was approximately 46% of our population in Cuyahoga County. As such, our overall target for investment in equity zones is 40%. When we have a selection process for roads, bridges, and any public policy, any of our programs and policies, our goal is that 40% will impact the equity zones. After the maps were developed, they were approved on February 15, 2022. That's approximately 2 months ago by the county executive via executive order. Next. And the resulting map, the equity zones are shown in red. We've moved swiftly to start having implementing policies and programs that would give additional consideration for these areas. Specifically, the County Planning Commission, as part of its urban tree canopy project grant program, is giving 5 points as part of the current selection process, gave 5 points out of a total of 100 points for projects applicants that are directly impacting equity zones. In addition, the CDBG municipal grant program, the current funding cycle, we awarded 10 points out of a total of 100 points for projects that were proposed to impact equity zones. And finally, still under selection is the county's local 50/50 road program. And for projects that impact equity zones, they will receive 10 points out of a total of 105 points. Again, so our goal is to spur and incentivize investment in those areas that have historically experienced disinvestment. The CDBG municipal grant program, out of the current funding cycle, are recommending 15 projects that directly impact equity zones for a total of approximately $2.14 million. Next. We're excited about the program, and we want to make sure that that is available for others to use, and that everyone, the public and the applicants to our various programs, are aware that we're trying to incentivize investment in those areas that have experienced historical disinvestment. So the map is available on the Cuyahoga County website, and there's a direct link, interactive map. Next, please. So that even if you're not applying to a county program, if you're implementing a program for which you have a selection process, you can use the county map. You can enter an address and determine if that project, if your area in particular interest is in the equity zone. So we're hoping to not only increase investment in our own projects, but also to provide an avenue for others to also use the map as a way to spur and incentivize investments in those areas. So again, thank you for this opportunity. This is just the beginning, and we're excited about the potential impact of this project on areas that are still experiencing the lasting negative impacts of historic disinvestment.
Thank you, Lenora. This really has the potential to move the needle on, and reinvestment in Cuyahoga County certainly serves as an example for other counties in our region, I think. So the question is, what does all this mean for the people? People who are living in these historically redlined areas, people who've never had an opportunity to own a home or build that generational wealth that Carrie discussed, people who are having difficulty finding stable or affordable housing. Our next speaker is Kevin Nowak, Executive Director of CHN Housing Partners. He runs an organization focused on opening up more housing choices and opportunities for quality, stable, affordable housing and home ownership. Kevin is responsible for the overall management of CHN, its 35 real estate partnerships, and combined annual operating and capital budget ranging from $55 to $75 million. CHN is a member of the NeighborWorks America network, chosen to administer both the first of its kind program here in Cleveland, Lead Safe Cleveland, and the Cleveland Cuyahoga $18 million CARES Act rental assistance program. Prior to CHN, Kevin was the National Equity Investment Manager of Key Community Development Corporation. He holds a bachelor's and a law degree from the University of Michigan. We won't hold that against you. Go ahead, Kevin.
Go blue. You led me to it, Rick.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about CHN's work and really how we're trying to bring more equity into our communities through the services that we deliver. So CHN is an organization. We were founded in 1981. We were founded by 6 CDCs in the city of Cleveland, and really we're meant to focus on scalability, in home ownership and housing stability. We focus on the power of a permanent address. And so we believe that safe, decent, affordable housing changes lives and improves communities. A big part of what CHN does is we partner with other organizations, sister nonprofits, government entities, financial institutions, really to try to seek that housing stability. We serve 50,000 annually. We own, manage 2,200 units. We've developed over 7,000 homes, and we've helped 1,400 families in Cleveland, Cuyahoga County become homeowners. When we bring our services, to the consumer, we're really trying to integrate as many services as we possibly can. And CHN is unique in the way that we deliver our services and that we have such a wide variety of housing services available. We are a real estate developer, owner, manager, really trying to create supply, of affordable housing, trying to create that power of permanent address, that foundation for people. We're a home lender through our nonprofit affordable mortgage company, CHN Housing Capital, which is also a community development financial institution. We provide emergency assistance from utilities, rental assistance. We help to improve homes, make people more housing stable through energy conservation, weatherization. We help people through our counseling education to get into homes, but then also to stay there when they run into trouble. And we work closely with the residents of our properties, in order to really create economic mobility opportunities for both generations, both the children as well as the heads of household through our community building engagement work. Go to the next slide. And as we're thinking about our community needs, I think I was earlier, Carrie was mentioning hierarchy of needs. This sure looks very familiar to her, in this presentation. And so, really what we try to do is empower people who come into our doors to get from where they are to where they want to be. And we organize our work around crisis intervention, stabilization, and enrichment, really try to get people from that crisis they might be in to stability, and then from stability to thriving at the end of that road. Go to the next slide. CHN as an organization really, as from our very beginning, was about home ownership and helping to eliminate the barriers that have been created for people to become homeowners. We talked about a lot of this earlier today already with the other presenters, but a couple of things that really wanted to point out. When you think about buying a home, you think about the capital intensive nature, the fact that you need to bring a down payment, right? Like the typical white family has a net worth that's nearly 10 times that of a typical Black family. That makes it difficult to be able to bring down payment to the table. When we look at Black borrowers coming to banks and non-bank lenders, we're seeing them disproportionately rejected compared to white borrowers. We're also seeing similar issues with appraisals when banks are doing appraisals within Black communities, or even for Black purchasers. What you end up seeing is disproportionately lower appraisals of homes in those communities, and for people of color who are otherwise looking to buy homes. We began our journey on trying to provide to fill this gap in lending through CHN's flagship lease purchase program. So we have developed 2,200 units over time through the low-income housing tax credit, single family scattered site homes that are a 15-year pathway to home ownership for our residents. Then at the end of that time, our residents can buy the homes. We've helped 1,400 plus families become homeowners through that program. And we provided 700 loans to people through that program that otherwise couldn't get access to mortgages from banks. And then, because of the success we had in that effort on the lending side, we then created CHN Housing Capital, which is a licensed mortgage lender. And we did that in 2019 to really try to bring more opportunity for mortgage lending, within Cuyahoga County. Go next slide. So when we did this, we really wanted to become that full service community lender. So if you were to go to Key Bank, or you were to go to Union Home Mortgage, or you were to go to other lenders, right? They often have a multitude of different types of products that you can get from them. So from the very beginning, we wanted to be able to provide that, but then provide it in a way that focused on eliminating the barriers for people who otherwise are traditionally left out of the market. So that meant, home mortgage loans that otherwise are more flexible in their credit terms. It meant making sure that we have down payment assistance available. It meant, providing for home repair loans and grants that otherwise people weren't able to get from banks. And then also, providing that counseling and education. So when someone comes in the door, if they otherwise are not ready to become a homeowner from a credit perspective, we help them to get there. And then if they stumble along the way as a homeowner, we're there to help them to get back on track. Next slide, please. So our Believe mortgage, looks at, like I said, eliminating barriers. So we have a low down payment requirement. We help people to become more educated around what it means to be a homeowner. We don't penalize people for bringing a lower down payment. So oftentimes lenders will require private mortgage insurance, which adds to the cost of a mortgage. We look at the entire borrower profile, not just the credit score, right? The credit score is something that we consider, but it's not the end all be all for us. And then we also provide a second mortgage that can help with home repair for that family when they take out the Believe mortgage. Next slide. On down payment assistance, I'm going to quickly run through these two. And I want to, and this first one here is one way that we're able to bring down payment assistance, which is through government dollars. This is actually funded through Cuyahoga County. Thank you, Lenora, and your friends at Cuyahoga County. And what this does is it uses federal resources that otherwise help low-income people to be able to participate in home ownership. So we use this in parts of Cuyahoga County to help with that down payment assistance. It's federal dollars, so it's not necessarily as flexible as we want it to be, right? And it's something that we're actually working on with the HUD secretary to try to improve the effectiveness of. Our friends at Cuyahoga County do a great job with it. It's really, we need the federal government to become to make it a little easier to use those dollars. Next slide. Next slide is non-federal money. So the city of Cleveland, through Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, otherwise provided for down payment assistance. This is not income restricted, but it really is about trying to incentivize home ownership in neighborhood stabilization in some neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland that otherwise have been deeply impacted by redlining, like Glenville. So we'll go to the next slide. So the final couple minutes I have here, I want to focus on what we did with our Believe mortgage product to be able to knock down some of these barriers. And what we found is, in our first year of bringing the product to the market, is that if you focus more directly on underserved people in markets, and you use traditional techniques that banks and non-bank lenders do for selling loans and for kind of making people aware of homeownership opportunity, you can be successful, right? We focused on several things. One was focusing on realtors that serve underserved markets, right? And by doing that, rather than going to the realtors who are doing the $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 homes in the burbs, we focused on realtors, primarily, minority-owned enterprises that are part of the Realtors Association, to really try to drive that origination activity within those parts of the east side of Cleveland and the inner ring burbs that otherwise have traditionally been left out of mortgage lending. All of our Believe mortgages with this focus in 2021 were to African American borrowers and in neighborhoods in the east side of Cleveland and the eastern ring burbs that are traditionally underserved. We focused on the product details, right? We wanted to make sure we were lowering that barrier on down payment, right? But then, like I mentioned earlier, not having that private mortgage insurance that otherwise drives up the cost of the loan, that otherwise may make that loan unattainable for that family. We wanted to make sure that we had more flexible credit scores. Not everyone has perfect credit. And actually, since Dodd-Frank came into play, as part of the Great Recession, it made it more difficult for people to get loans who had credit scores that that may have been challenged. So that's something that we've provided for more flexibility on. Finally, we focused on we focused on the if we go back to the next slide real quick, small dollar loans. So in so many of our communities, we are just not seeing small dollar loan origination. Our average loan size was $84,000. We actually, in another product that we offer, we actually did 50 loans that were under $30,000. All right. And then for our Believe mortgage, our average size is 84,000. It's something that we're going to continue to focus on because, again, when you go to those areas that have been redlined, that's where you see the lower property values. And if you're not seeing transactions happen because people aren't lending in those neighborhoods, you aren't going to see that increase in property values happen. And then finally, on the last slide, utilizing the right vendors. When we think about appraisals and issues with appraisals, we need to make sure that banks, non-bank lenders, groups like CHN Housing Capital are using appraisal management firms that like DwellWorks that otherwise understand the communities and aren't penalizing our communities because of where they are, or who they are, de facto. So, thank you.
Kevin, before we move on, there was one quick question that came in. I know I was looking ahead. Just ask for a 30, 40-second definition of how CHN came to be.
Yeah, sure. So we were created by 6 CDCs, in community development corporations within the city of Cleveland. And the whole point of the effort was to create essentially a shared service model where CHN can provide that sort of scale across the entire city, for home ownership and housing stability services. And since then, we've grown to be really kind of super regional 4-state organization, but with most of what we're doing in Cuyahoga.
Thank you, Kevin. I know from previous interactions, that's just the tip of the iceberg for the many programs and services CHN offers, but thanks for the baseline there. Now it's my pleasure to welcome everybody back to the table for real talk about the impact that partisan politics is having on various things. A reminder, you can put questions into the chat feature if you would like. We'll add those into the upcoming conversation. The panelists again, Carrie Pleasance, Executive Director, Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research, Jason Segedy, Director of Planning and Urban Development, City of Akron, Lenora Lockett, Director, Department of Equity and Inclusion for Cuyahoga County, and Kevin, whom you just heard, is the Executive Director of CHN Housing Partners. And to start, we wanted to know how you've involved the people that you serve in designing these programs. And Lenora, I'll go to you first.
Thank you for the opportunity. So we have various departments, but after we had a preliminary map, we did send out information to the Mayors and Managers Association, and we also did a presentation to the Municipal Economic Development Directors meeting so that, again, the communities that will be applying for county funding for our various programs are aware of the criteria that we were going to be using to make the selections.
Kevin, how have you involved people you serve? I mean, you just gave us a little bit of a headline there, but directly.
Yeah, absolutely. When we're developing programs, we're reaching out to both like direct former customers of ours, CDCs, cities, counties. So when we looked at, for example, our rental assistance program that we developed with Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, we all sat down together and determined how to develop that program. And then we went to community groups to understand whether they thought that we would be adequately serving the community through that. We do a similar process for our developments. For example, we have a development for transition age youth that we'll be breaking ground on in July. They have been part of the development, actually helped to select the site, helped to select the services, and are part of the governing board of that effort.
Jason, the city's a much bigger animal here to wrestle. How do you directly involve people?
By many different conduits, but maybe since I talked about it, I'll focus on the Interbelt engagement. So I had mentioned that we had hired Liz Ogbu to start to put together a public engagement process that'll roll out this late spring and summer. I do think that's really important. The Interbelt Freeway, if you look back at the history, the way it was constructed, people were not engaged. And one thing I always try to remind myself of, and there may be people who disagree, but many, I don't know if it was most, but many of the people who planned that road, whether that was elected officials or corporate leaders or others, actually did think they were doing the right thing for the community. And I think it's like a cautionary tale that good intentions don't equal good results. And of course, there were bad intentions too, don't get me wrong. But so when we embark on our public engagement process, most certainly we have good intentions, but we really do want to get good results also and engage people thoughtfully. I really like that Liz is reaching out to the actual people who are displaced as well as their descendants. I think that's really important, that they should have a very strong voice in what happens in the future.
Thank you. We've got a lot of great questions coming in. We'll get to as many as we can. We do have plenty of time here. Carrie, talk about ARPA and the other federal funds. How should we be using them if we really want to reinvest in these historically disadvantaged places and people?
Sure. I think that all of the funding needs to have the lens of fair housing, have the lens of social justice and equity on those funds, and who has been hurt and who's hit hardest by COVID and by the pandemic. So that always needs to be central in mind, I think, when we're thinking about how we spend these types of dollars.
Mm-hmm. Jason, same thing. When you look at that big pot of ARPA money sitting there, I just had the mayor on the program, on my program last week, talking about what we can do. What would you like to do?
The mayor has divided, his plan for the ARPA funding into a couple different buckets. We presented that to Akron City Council in our capital budget hearings, but the one that I've been the most personally engaged with and I'm very excited about is to allocate $10 to $15 million for rehabilitation of older homes in Akron. So, 20 years ago or so, when the HUD dollars were coming a little bit more fluidly into Akron, we had a pretty comprehensive housing rehabilitation program. We would do hundreds of homes a year in targeted neighborhoods that were targeted based on income characteristics and the condition of the housing. And our hope is to use ARPA to replicate, at least in some ways, those previous programs. Anybody on here who's involved with ARPA knows it's difficult to know exactly what it's eligible for still, and we're working with a lot of partners to try to figure that out. But I'm excited about the opportunity to rebuild some of our older and more disinvested neighborhoods.
Even those of us who don't deal with ARPA directly know there are obstacles and roadblocks when you have to deal with that kind of federal money. Kevin, this question's for you. It says, is race the only determining factor for Black borrowers when rejecting their loans, or does it factor in job stability, credit scores, age, etc.?
Sure. So when a bank or a non-bank lender is doing an evaluation of a credit file, there are certain things that it needs to look at. Based upon however they have developed the loan product and what they're selling to like agencies like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, right? So things like a credit score, things like an employment history, debt to income ratios, how much your housing cost is compared to your income. So there are a number of factors that are considered, in this criteria. But what you see when you take that criteria and you compare it based upon demographics, you often see that Black households are still being denied more commonly than white households, right? And so that's where you come into a real disparate impact question, around race and lending.
Mm-hmm. We can look at the numbers. We know that 64% of Americans own homes, but only 47% of ethnic minorities own the homes. That rate even lower for Black people, 43%. We look at the large cities with the lowest minority home ownership across the country, Columbus, Ohio, in the top 8. I think until we change those numbers, talking about home improvements is not necessarily effective. And to that point, Lenora had a question asking you to talk a little bit more about the investments in equity zones, where they will go. Will there be funding for single family homes so we can drive those numbers up?
So again, the initial focus is roads, bridge, and infrastructure development projects, but it also includes policies and programs. So we're looking to expand it as much as applicable and feasible by the different funding sources that are available. So yes, there's no stop in that, nothing precluding that being an option at this point.
Would that include parks?
It's eligible, but I mean, if there aren't too many parks that the county participates in, we are
Okay.
mainly roads, bridges. There for CDBG, for the municipal grant programs, there can be applications from municipalities for programs that improve communities, which that would possibly, I'm not an expert at the CDBG municipal grant program, but as a part of, as an application, that a park improvement could be potentially funded based on the impact in the equity zone.
Thank you. Kevin Nowak had a viewer write in and say, is your program available in Lorain County? Has Summit started to spread things?
Yes, yep. So, you know, our Believe mortgage product is available in Lorain County. CHN also provides other services in Lorain County, whether it be utility assistance, weatherization, counseling, education. We're doing our first, development project in the city of Lorain. We applied for low-income housing tax credit. So yes, it's available in Lorain.
Got a great question came in, and they specifically asked that all of you answer this one. So I'll read the question. I'll go to you first, Carrie. The question is there a correlation between unfair housing practices and the Black realtor? Because Black realtors are generally not, quote, at the table. Carrie, and then Jason.
Sure. The Realtists Association was created because African Americans were not allowed to be join the realtors, so they created their own association to become realtists. But sure, there's obviously a correlation between the lack of realtors that are people of color and unfair practices, I would say.
Jason.
You know, we work closely with the realtists at the city of Akron. I think when I interact a fair amount with real estate professionals, I think it's very fair to say that the percentage of Black versus white realtors does not correspond to the percentage of Black versus white residents in Akron or even in Summit County. So I think we would definitely like to see more Black residents have the opportunity to get into that industry. I do think it's a very important question because, cities in particular, I'm sure this is very similar in Cleveland. There are a lot of people, I think, when they're looking for a home that automatically tend to write off the central city or most certainly particular neighborhoods in the central city. And so I do think having more realtors that are people of color and that are more familiar with the city, regardless of their color, it is important to make sure that we have equal opportunities both for residents to look for homes and to give Akron, in Cleveland as well, a fair shake when people are looking for homes.
Well, Kevin, give us the Cleveland perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is applicable within the city of Cleveland, Cuyahoga County. Our Realtist Association members really are helping to drive that homeownership opportunity in a real way. In our underserved communities, they've been a key partner of ours to be able to launch and deliver on the Believe mortgage and just really provide a great service for our community.
Mm-hmm. And Lenora, equity and inclusion, part of the title of your department. Do we see enough of the African American realtors joining in with bigger discussions?
Thank you. I would definitely say just in general, as we know that systemic racism, the lack of opportunities and access has impacted all areas of the communities. That doesn't mean that every instance is directly related, but it is embedded in the overall outcomes and the disparity between health, wealth, careers. It embeds the entire, it impacts the entire environment.
Okay. Had another question for you. Wanted you to talk about the Cuyahoga County Land Bank, how it may be helping with home ownership in redlined areas. Lenora, I guess, and then Kevin.
I'm not as familiar with the land bank. I understand that they have several programs with the county with different funding that different cities can apply as far as looking at properties that have maybe been requiring getting those lands and foreclosures to make sure that they're eligible and eligible for future development. Similarly, but I can't really speak on any further details on that, but I'm happy to get any particulars and follow up to get that information and respond later if they put it in the chat.
Thank you. Kevin.
Yes, Cuyahoga Land Bank has been a key partner of ours as we've been doing our work, both in rental and in home ownership. They have access to vacant land. They have access to vacant homes, right? They have some work that they do themselves where they're doing infill, housing, as well as acquisition of rehab housing. They can really help to facilitate the availability of those properties for either for their own development, which is somewhat they do, but then also with development partners, whether they be small contractors who otherwise are maybe doing one property at a time, or groups like ours, or a for-profit market rate like home builder like Knez.
Thank you. Again, just a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat. We're using some of these questions here because you're coming up with good stuff. Here's one that's interesting. They wanted somebody to comment on the opportunity corridor and public engagement. I guess they may mean by public engagement the fact that it was kind of put through on a top-down level rather than a bottom-up level. Who wants to jump in and talk opportunity corridor? Jason, I guess you're excluded from this one.
I could provide a general overview. Usually with especially major infrastructure projects, there is a required public involvement, public engagement process. In addition to just the general legislative process, where there's usually 3 readings for the impacted communities, there's also, if you're going to need to acquire property, there's standard processes and procedures that must take place in order to make sure that there's engagement about the property, not only with the property owners, but also the alignment and the development of the roadway projects. I can't speak specifically on what happened with the opportunity corridor, but in general, with major infrastructure improvements, there is a significant public involvement and public engagement requirements.
Carrie, we did see some houses taken for the op corridor.
Sorry, what was the question?
I said we did see some houses and properties that were taken for the opportunity corridor. Do you deal with anything like that? The engagement that would have gone on between people and entities that wanted to build things such as a big project like that?
We don't. We weren't contacted by anyone who had concerns about it, so I can't really comment on.
Okay, thanks for that.
Sorry.
Another question that the presenter here wanted everybody to weigh in on. When we talk about the redlining, we talk about different neighborhoods. You just mentioned city neighborhoods not seeing as much interplay from maybe white realtors. Question is, are there efforts to integrate predominantly white communities, which I guess would be the reverse? Kevin, I'll go to you first.
Sure. There's several efforts for that that are federally driven in part, right? So there's a standard called affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a federal standard that the Biden administration is following. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they significantly impact the mortgage market. They have something that's called the duty to serve, which is their duty to serve, really extends to helping to encourage homeownership opportunity for all. And I've seen them working some and trying to do further integration within predominantly white neighborhoods. And then, things like the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, OFA, they run the low income housing tax credit program. The low income housing tax credit program is the program that, develops and preserves the most affordable housing across the country annually. as part of their process for allocating tax credits, they incentivize, funding and development of projects, in higher income areas they would say are areas of greater opportunity, which doesn't always translate to white neighborhoods, but often what you see is that helping to drive more development into areas that are predominantly white instead of all low-income housing going into areas that are predominantly black.
Thanks. I'm reminded we'll be hearing more about federal fair housing efforts in next week's part 2 of this program. Carrie Pleasance, the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. Do you do a lot of work in trying to integrate neighborhoods?
Sure, that's as part of our mission, and really, when I mentioned earlier that the Federal Fair Housing Act has really those 2 parts, and the first one was, to eliminate discrimination, and that's the one that really gets the most attention. But that second part, which we often talk about as the forgotten part of federal fair housing law, is to promote integration. And that's what, as Kevin mentioned, affirmatively furthering fair housing is another term that's used by cities often, and they all have a responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing, to work to integrate their communities, to examine their own policies and practices to see if they're doing anything that maybe unintentionally or intentionally might be doing something that might be impeding fair housing and impeding integration in their community. And one thing I think that communities are doing that can really help with integration, and I know that the county is looking to potentially pass this as well, is source of income legislation, where communities will not, landlords will not be able to turn away someone simply based on the fact that they use a subsidy to pay their rent. So that would be extremely helpful in integrating communities that are traditionally white, because people will, the average person in Cuyahoga County that uses a subsidy, like what used to be called Section 8, a housing choice voucher subsidy, is an African-American female with children. So if landlords were no longer allowed to turn people away, just solely based on the fact that they use a subsidy to help them pay their rent, that could go a long way in helping to integrate our communities.
In your presentation, you did talk about the Fair Housing Act of 1968. I was just kind of wondering if you wax philosophic for us. How might Northeast Ohio look different if we adhere not just to the letter, but to the spirit of that law?
I mean, I think it would look completely different. I mean, it should look like, I think a lot of people look to Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights as 2 of the communities in Northeast Ohio that took the Fair Housing Act more to heart, as and being a lot more proactive in promoting integration, and I think that's what more of Northeast Ohio would look like, just my personal opinion. But if that was taken more to heart.
Staying with this idea of integration, Jason, I think I've mentioned to you before that I have family that lives in the city of Akron in a fairly mixed race area. What does the city have to do to see more of that throughout Greater Akron?
I think it's a great question, because I think integration has fallen off the radar a lot in the national urban policy discussion. I've lived my whole life, other than college, in Akron's Ward 4, and I grew up on a street where basically half of the residents were white and half were black. And I grew up thinking that was pretty normal. And then I got a little older and realized that basically nobody grows up like that. And I think it's very important. And since this is real talk, I will say, I in my lifetime, I think from to some degree from both sides of the aisle. There is less talk about integration than there was. And I think it's really important. I think having an Akron where more neighborhoods and more streets look like the city as a whole is very important. And I will say, and I always have a caveat for this, Akron is the least segregated larger city in Ohio, which still means it's quite segregated. But we are proud of that, and we would like to see more neighborhoods that are more integrated and doing what we can as a city administration. I know the mayor feels strongly about that as well.
Thanks. Kevin, a viewer wants to know what's the default rate 5 years in on CHN issued loans?
Sure, it's less than 2%.
Fantastic number.
Thank you.
Idea we haven't touched on, somebody wants to know about gentrification, negative consequences. Carrie, do we see people being displaced because neighborhoods are suddenly posh?
Sure, we do. I mean, I think that's an issue in communities like Tremont, Ohio City, Gordon Square. That's an issue that I don't think has an easy answer because, of course, we all want neighborhoods to improve. We want services to improve, but we also want them to improve for the people that have grown up there, who live there, who want to remain there. And we need to find some way to allow them to stay there and not be priced out of the community as well.
Lenora, is that something Cuyahoga County is A, looking into, and B, concerned about?
Again, I've heard some communications about it. We don't have any active ordinances that directly address it. I know we're talking about more inclusivity with the pay to stay and the source of income. I haven't heard any tangible direct legislation related to gentrification.
Mm-hmm. Jason?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just full disclosure, I don't care for the word gentrification because I think it's vague. The word I like is displacement. So we don't want to see people displaced from their neighborhoods. I do think cities like Cleveland and Akron have an opportunity. I think, I'll just use the word. I just said I hate the word, but I'll use it. Gentrification's been a real issue in places like New York and Washington and selected neighborhoods in other cities. But I do think given the profile of our housing market and the costs and the supply and demand, that I do think we have an opportunity here to have more equitable redevelopment. I mean, it kind of ties back to the previous question about integration, right? Like if we're going to be open to integration, we have to be open to people of whatever race living closer to people of other races. But most certainly we need to do that in a way that existing residents are not displaced and existing residents don't feel like they're losing their community. So I don't have like a super easy soundbite answer to that, but it is a tough question. I think we need to keep our eye on the ball and not err on one side or the other of precluding opportunity for reinvestment in disinvested neighborhoods, but also doing right by the people that live there.
Well, given that, how do we ensure that any wealth that's generated in those neighborhoods as a result of our public tax dollars going in benefits the people who live there?
Yeah, I think that is, there are cities that have looked at things like freezing property taxes for existing residents in areas where property values increase precipitously. We haven't seen that in Akron, but that is something that's on our radar and that I think we would be open to looking into. Sometimes with large developments, which we haven't seen a lot of either, but you can have community benefit agreements or other things that do redistribute some of that wealth or investment to make sure that the people in the community where the development's taking place benefit from that. So I think it's something that the playbook is still kind of being written on it, and it's important to be open to different models of of making sure that development is equitable and fair to the people who live in the neighborhood presently.
Yeah, let me go back to Carrie on that part too. How do we make sure that the wealth that we place there is benefiting those who are already there rather than those who will flock to it because we put wealth there?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I have a specific answer. I wanted to comment that one of the issues that we've seen a lot has been, people that may have lived in apartment buildings or duplex, they may have lived there for decades, right, and been able to pay their rent, and then suddenly the neighborhood starts to gentrify, the values go up, the rents are going up in other buildings, and then suddenly that landlord or property owner knows that they can probably get a lot more money for those units, so they're kicking everyone out of those units. So that person is losing their stable housing that they could have had for decades. They've been a good resident. Maybe they're using a voucher and they've been there for 20 years or something, and they can't find anywhere else in the neighborhood to go because there's nowhere else to go at their price point. And that's really one of our bigger concerns about people that are unable to stay in the community that they've called home for such a long time.
Great comment came in from Barry referencing your word displacement. He says it removes blame. He says hurricanes cause displacement. Gentrification is a process by humans. So thanks for that. And really thanks to everybody who wrote in. We have one final question. I want everybody to kind of answer this one as we begin to close here. The question, what are the barriers, real and perceived, individuals face in trying to access affordable housing in these opportunity areas? And Kevin, I'll go to you first.
Sure. And of course, my dog just started barking like crazy.
Oh, of course.
She's not as vicious as she sounds. Yeah. So when we're looking at barriers, one is zoning. Zoning allows for municipalities to be able to control what type of development is done in that municipality. And many municipalities will use it to exclude multifamily housing. So that's one piece to it. The second is when we think about home ownership and the price of home ownership, our federal subsidies that otherwise support it, such as the Home Investment Partnership Program, which funds the DPA that I mentioned earlier that we have with Cuyahoga County, actually does not allow for assisting on homes that are over about $149,000 locally. And so when you think about that and you look at the maps that Carrie and Jason showed earlier, that actually requires most home-assisted homeownership units to end up going within those areas that otherwise were the redlined areas. So we're working with the federal legislatures to try to get that changed. So those are a couple of barriers.
Thank you. Lenora, same idea, barriers, real and perceived.
Well, I'll start with the perceived. There's still the historical perception of areas or neighborhoods that are not welcoming to people of color. Mm-hmm. And so that precludes, if this is going to be your place, your home, where your family and your children feel at peace, if you don't feel like you're welcome, that it's really a neighborhood that will accept you, then regardless of the price of the loan, the access to capitals or the opportunities, there will be no mental peace for you in that area. So you got to promote inclusivity and welcoming. And one of the examples I give when I talk about our supplier diversity program is that most people know if you knock on a door, for most people, if you knock on a door, someone will answer. I say, but once you've had a negative impact on a relationship, you have to do more than just answer the door. You have to open the door to let them know that you're welcoming for guests. You might put balloons out, turn the light on the porch. You have to do things to let people know that you're being inclusive and open for awareness. Then there's the tangible items, tangible factors. Access to capital. We're talking about programs that the county and government can provide. However, most people get their homes and loans through a private institution. So it's not only the county changing, but also and providing opportunities. We have to make sure that extended throughout the community, that there's more ability for people to provide get access to buy those homes and get loans for businesses and things of that sort. And finally, there's the just the opportunity to sustain through career and good educations. So job opportunities and an education to prepare you for those job opportunities.
Another barrier that often comes up is we talk about people finding the money to get out of where they are and into a, quote, nicer neighborhood, but the bus doesn't go there. So maybe that's a different problem that we face. Carrie, barriers, real or perceived?
I mean, I think a real barrier that is still housing discrimination, maybe not as blatant as it once was, but it's still very much real. Another barrier for people, if they are using subsidies, is how much that subsidy can get them in areas of opportunity. How much is that security deposit? Do they have money for the security deposit? For all those application fees, are they is that subsidy going to go far enough to pay that rent in those communities? So I think a lot of it is economic as well.
Only one person left. Bring us home.
Okay, well, I don't have time to do justice to the topic, but I'll try to do what justice I can. If you look at a city like Akron, we were routinely ranked first or second in the country as the most affordable housing market for people who can afford a home, which is not as much money as it is other places in the country. But our challenge is not so much for owner-occupied homes, but for renters. So we have a whole lot of people who don't make enough money to buy a home, and they are renters. And their affordability problem here is significant. You know, I would argue it's significant in every city in this country if you look at the data. And I don't have an easy answer on it, but I do like Alan Malik's idea of a more robust federal housing entitlement to help people afford rent. I mean, I think everyone on here knows that the cost of construction is going nowhere but up. With inflation and with supply chain issues. So it's a bigger issue than ever. But I think in our area in particular, it's the affordability issue is very centered on renters. And that is something that we have to try to figure out. It's important.
Thank you all, Jason Segedy, Carrie Pleasance, Lenora Lockett, Kevin Nowak. Thank you for a great hour-and-a-half conversation here. Now, Catherine Hexter, the Program Director, League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, will walk us through some of the steps that you can take that could help out.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you to all our panelists for a really engaging discussion. We didn't get to all the questions, but I think we got to most of them. So what can you do? As the League of Women Voters always likes to end these programs with ways that people in attendance can actually do something about it. So at the federal level, sort of picking up on what Jason just said, urge Congress to allocate more funding for affordable housing and fair housing programs. You can get more information from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and the link is here and will be in the chat. At the state level, we're asking people to join with Cuyahoga. I believe CHN Housing Partners is signed on to this, and over 160 other groups to support taking money from the ARPA funds. Ohio got almost $6 billion in ARPA funds. And the idea is to take 300,000+ something of that for affordable housing and homeless programs. And the link is there. And then also to support tenant protection measures at the state level so that every city doesn't have to pass a source of income discrimination law or an LGBTQ discrimination law. And at the local level, register voters. One of the interesting things that Catherine LaCroix likes to talk about is that in redlined areas, voter turnout, historically redlined areas have the lowest voter turnout. There's a definite correlation there. So we need people to help us hand out voter guides, urge people to register, learn about your local housing issues. Housing is very often thought of as just such a local issue, and you really need to pay attention to city and county government meetings, observe planning and zoning committees, etc. So again, Cuyahoga, which is a great resource, has information for every county in Ohio. CHN Housing Partners administers the county funding for rental emergency eviction protection programs. So contact CHN. And in Summit County, contact the Community Action of Akron and Summit. And monitor how your local communities are using their ARPA funds. Ask questions. This is like a one-time source of funding. It is hard to use it for housing, but there are ways that it can be done. And those are some ways that you can take action.
Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Special thanks again to our panelists, Carrie Pleasance, Jason Segedy, Lenora Lockett, and Kevin Nowak. This has all been a great lead into the second part of our series, Housing Justice, Universal, Stable, Affordable Housing. That'll be next Wednesday, same time, 7 o'clock on Zoom. Keynote speaker will be Demetria McCain, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She'll talk about how the federal government's stepping up its efforts to fight housing discrimination. We also have a great lineup of local speakers who will share perspectives from the grassroots, talking about the ways they are working to overcome the barriers that people are experiencing on the ground as they try and find stable, affordable housing in areas where they'd like to live. Quick reminder, the recording, the slide deck, list of resources from tonight's event will be emailed to all of you who registered and uploaded to the Real Talk website.